We went up there and just kind of on an impulse. I think there was a car at the first turnout from the south end of the lake going north. And the second one or the third one was open. I just turned in and I said, let's go down, walk down by the lakeside. And we did. It was about probably a couple hundred yards down to the edge of the lake, because this particular turnout, it wasn't necessarily just going down to the shoreline, it was actually out on a peninsula. And the peninsula during the wintertime would be an island when the water was higher. And there were about 3 live oak trees out on the peninsula, and we laid down a blanket and we're chatting. I ran into Cecilia at the cafeteria. It's a fairly small school and campus. Most of the meals are taken on campus, and I ran into her. Probably a couple, 300 people in the cafeteria, and I happened to run into her. She came to me, I don't remember which, and we were still good friends. We dated a couple years before. And
what was it?
Pacific Union College, and we decided to go into San Francisco. We'd been in there many times, and when we went to school there together. She was going, I think, to UC Riverside at the time, and was just coming up to visit friends. So we went down to St. Helena, and I think we looked in a rummage sale or something. We got distracted. We didn't make it all the way out of town, and then when we looked at the clock, it was clear that we were not going to make it to the city and back. I had some responsibilities that evening that I had to be back for. So we decided instead to take the loop up to Lake Berryessa.
There's a lot of activity up at Berryessa during the summer months, but after Labor Day, when all the kids go back to school, it kind of quiets down. And this was September 27th, probably 3.5 weeks after Labor Day. So it was a very, very quiet Saturday evening up there. The weather was nice. Napa's kind of a secluded community. We're bordered on both sides by major highways, Highway 80 to our east and Highway 101 to our west. And so we don't get a lot of the traffic coming through Napa that some of the other cities do. So we have a relatively low crime rate. We can sometimes go several years without a homicide. I think that particular year we had 5 or 6, which is unusual.
It was a Saturday, late in the afternoon, around 6:15. I was on patrol. The dispatcher notified me by radio that he had received a report of a double stabbing at Lake Berryessa, and I was to respond. So I notified my partner, who was Deputy Ray Land, at the time was in St. Helena. I was in Napa on the northeast side of town. We both began to proceed to Lake Berryessa.
The shoreline at that spot was a little on the steep side, so that I could lay on my back and pretty much see out across the lake. She was laying somewhat diagonally with her hands on my chest, and we were probably about 12 inches our faces apart, and we were talking, and I noticed that she was becoming distracted. She said, "There's a man over there." And I assumed, since we're out on a peninsula and there was a spit of water between where we were and the next area over. It's kind of hard to describe. With a reservoir, you have more peninsulas and irregular shoreline because you're filling up a ravine, if you will. Where a lake, if it's been there a long time, it's pretty much rounded around the edge. This wasn't that old a reservoir, and so as a consequence, you had a very irregular shoreline. And we're at one area, then there was water in between, then there was another area, another place where people could go. And I thought they were on the other side of the water.
And everybody who's not a tree, can we clear out this way?
See, if that's a tree, that's a tree, that's a tree, and that's the one he probably was behind. We're a little closer, but remember we talked about the fact that this is all eroded. So that was the closest tree. There was a tree there. That puts me probably about in here, okay? And I'm facing this way, laying on my back. And Cecilia is on her stomach facing this way, actually facing kind of like this. So her head's facing that way. And we're talking. And when she says, I see a man over there, what I'm thinking is, if you look to the left of her, you can see those trees on that hill. That would be another picnic area. So seeing someone on that hill, would be of interest, but not of any great urgency. But seeing someone as close as her would obviously be some cause for concern. And so I'm continuing to talk, and then she says, he went behind a tree. And so he goes behind the tree where she is, and again, I'm thinking behind those trees over there. So then when she says, oh, he's got a gun, he's walking this direction, and I turn around, and from there to here, he's probably made it to about here. So we're about half the distance between the tree and me. And so that was my first running into him, and it was really somewhat of a surprise that he was that close, because again, I was looking at the other area. I'll tell you another thing that probably made me think that it was somebody over there. It wasn't an improved park site. There wasn't regular established bathrooms, so if you had to use the restroom, you just kind of get out of eye shot of whoever you were with, or go behind a tree or something like that. So when she says he went behind a tree, that actually validated what I thought was happening on the 1,000 feet away, that someone was actually relieving themselves behind a tree, and I commented. She still wasn't paying attention, which to me was kind of distracting, because why should you worry if someone that far away was doing whatever they're doing? And then her eyes got wide and she says, oh my God, he's got a gun. And I turn around and I'm faced with this man, not running, but walking briskly toward me with a gun in his hand, wearing a hood, black hood. It comes down in the front, across his chest and back up, like an overlay or a dicky. I'm assuming it was on the back as well, although I don't remember seeing it on the back. And on the front was about a 4-inch across circle with crosshairs, and it looked like it was made with a machine or with some degree of care. It wasn't just scrawled on with white paint. It was proportional. But at the time it really didn't strike me, because it was just something that a person was putting over themselves so that they wouldn't be seen. I mean, it could have come from a costume shop or a novelty store. The symbolism on it really didn't mean anything. He didn't identify himself as being the Zodiac. In fact, as soon as I get up, he goes, okay, hold on everybody, nothing to be afraid of. All I want is your money, and I need your car. If everybody stays cool, nobody's going to get hurt. And I believed him.
The only thing to me, this came out since then, but he told me at that time that he had killed a guard getting out of a prison, and so I did take him as a killer. To me, a killer isn't a normal person, so I assumed at the time that something was wrong, but as far as a psychopath or any other aberration, I really didn't realize at the moment. I wasn't concerned, because I was cooperating with him, and I expected that he would cooperate with me. And I tried to be as accommodating under the circumstances as possible to save the girl, any harm. He wanted our money. And I actually laughed at the moment, because I told him, I says, I've only got 75 cents in my pocket, and I says, you're welcome to have it. But if you need help, I'm sure I can give you help otherwise. And I asked him what his problem was, and he mentioned that he was a convict trying to get to Mexico and needed money and transportation. And I offered him assistance. I told him what I was doing in school, and that if I could be of any assistance whatsoever, I offered him my phone number, anything like this, and this just isn't what he wanted. He said he wanted money, and I was really sorry. I said, you got to check if I'd really like to help you, if you would be willing to accept help. He said, well, what I need right now is to get you tied up.
He pulled some cuts of 3-foot lengths of clothesline. It's actually plastic. It's the kind that's hollow in the center. And he handed those to Cecilia and asked her to tie me up.
Of course, she was real nervous and tied me rather loosely. And he came and he tightened the knots up, and then he tied her up. And we continued a dialogue along most of this time.
I'm trying to engage him in conversation the whole time. Where you been? What's, you know, where you headed? Trying to ask follow-up questions. I was taking a sociology class, and I thought I might be able to squeeze a paper out of it. While she was tying me up, I mentioned to her that I thought that I could get the gun, that if I was just to move a little bit closer, I could reach over and get it. And she says, "Oh, no, don't try anything." Well, he stepped back about 2 or 3 feet from that, and I never really had an opportunity again. You know, the odds are, if someone's robbing you, you should cooperate and don't try any heroics, because you stand a much greater chance of having harm occur. And I felt if I was going to change the odds, I probably at least ought to ask her. And obviously she declined, and I never had the opportunity again. As soon as we were tied, he then said he wanted me to get down and lay on my stomach so that he could tie my feet and I kind of fussed with him a bit, and I said, you know, it was really cold in the evenings, which really wasn't so much cold, it was just the inconvenience of being stuck out all night. And I said, get down, and he put the gun at me. He tied us up with our feet, then our feet to our hands, so we were essentially hog-tied. And I got the impression we were kind of getting near the end. I mean, there wasn't anything much more he could do. He was going to leave. He was going to take my keys, take whatever money I had there. And I kind of looked around and I said, can you do me a favor? Tell me, was the gun really loaded? I don't know where I'd read it, but I'd read it someplace that people that do robberies didn't want to ever be convicted of shooting somebody, so that on many occasions they would leave the gun unloaded, so if something happened they wouldn't shoot somebody, and their penalty if they were caught was less. I know that sounds preposterous in this day and age, because, I mean, everybody has loaded guns, but that's what I had read. And I asked him, I said, is the gun really loaded? He pulls the gun and pulls out the clip and shows me a full clip, puts it back, sticks it in his holster. And I'm thinking, okay, you know, that's interesting. And I put my head down, because it's like he put the gun away. He's going to leave now. Obviously, we couldn't do anything. We're tied up, and I'm obviously not going to be making any moves. And I'm just kind of trying to collect my thoughts. What are we going to do? How am I going to get out of this? You know, figuring out what options we had. And I saw just the kind of a flash out of the corner of my eye. He pulls the knife, and the next thing I know is I feel it in my back. He stabbed me, I think, 6 times, and they were in fairly quick succession. The difference, of course, was Cecilia. If she saw what was happening, she saw what was happening then, and I'm sure she must have known what was going to happen to her. So she's saying, stop, stop. She's trying to roll away. She's petrified, obviously. I mean, she was scared to begin with, and then when she saw this, she knew that what was going to happen. When he goes to stab her, she's moving. I mean, I'm basically a stationary person. He has a place to stab, and he's doing it. With her, she's rolling away, and you know, to be perfectly frank, if what they've captured on the film that you see when Cecilia is being stabbed, and I never had anything to do with the scene, but that's the flash I saw happening, and I had to look away. And about the time you would look away, that's when that piece ends in the film. It's an eerie reproduction of what happened in my vision. I couldn't have scripted it better, because it was, you know, that was happening, and I remember saying, she's gonna die. And I put my head back. I just could not look any further. Now when I put my head back, it flashed upon me that if I'm moving around, he's gonna come back and finish me off. So I froze, quit breathing. I swear I could have stopped breathing for 10 minutes. But pretty soon she lost consciousness, or he felt he'd done an adequate job to kill her. And I sensed that he was standing there looking, and then he just walked off. I thought I was dying. It's starting to get real dark around me. It's kind of like if you're going into an anesthetic, I suppose. You're just, all of a sudden, your consciousness is disappearing. It's probably like an electric motor. When you shut off an electric motor, it doesn't turn off right away. There's a flywheel that takes a while to slow down, and I felt that just slowing down, and I knew I was going to die. And then it, just before it was like lights out, it kind of leveled off. And I mean, you know, it's kind of, you're waiting to hit the ground and you don't hit the ground, and I'm thinking, well, wait a minute, maybe I've got a shot here. And so I started talking to her, and she was in a lot of pain, crying, really upset, obviously. I was able to, with my teeth, loosen her knots enough to, but her hands were, it was so tight that her hands were still numb. And I asked her if she could get mine undone, and she couldn't move them. And she really wasn't in any position to move. I mean, she was pretty badly injured.
I was able to untie one of her hands, but she was too weak to untie me at that time. So I scooted into a position where I could be looking out across the lake, and after calling several times, I found one position that had a little more echo to it that I thought was a little louder. And I called, and several boats went by, but they didn't stop. I don't know if they thought we were joking or what, but finally one fisherman who was going real slow, he stopped. He shut off his motor, and we cajoled and called, and we did everything to try to get him to come.
If I recall correctly, there was an island about maybe 50 yards off the edge, probably not even that. The island was fairly close, and the little boat went in between. And I got its attention, screaming and hollering at them, turned off the engine, and looked. It just seemed like forever, and I'm begging him to come over and help us. I could see two figures in the boat. He turned the engine on and went down the lake. We're sunk. I don't know what we're going to do. And about that time, I felt hands at my back. And she'd gotten enough strength and enough energy in her hands that she was able to get one knot loose enough that I was able to, then with my own hands and working it, be able to get my hands free. I untied her legs and my legs and feet, start getting some circulation back in it. And after a little bit, I thought, you know, the only way around this, I'm gonna have to make it back up to the road. So I got up and I made it about 5 feet, and the sparkles and the darkness came back, and I had to drop down immediately to keep from passing out. I'd lost too much blood. I had no energy to move. So I waited a minute, got some more strength, and I thought, okay, I'm gonna have to do this a little slower. And I made it another 5 feet and dropped down myself. So I just started taking 5, 10 feet intervals, and I found that if I wasn't really trying to walk fast, if I would bend over and hold my hands around my chest and kind of walk bent over and walk slower, I could make more distance between having to stop and rest. I made it about halfway to the road. There was a little kind of a utility dirt trail, road, what have you, that the Forest Service must have used for their patrols. And I saw some lights coming, and so I stopped in the road, and kind of on my hands and knees I was waving at them. The vehicle stopped, and I saw somebody get out of the truck that was wearing a heavy jacket and a flashlight, and I couldn't see the face, and I thought, oh no, he's come back. Well, then he turned slightly when he came around as far as the lights, and I could see that he had some type of an official emblem on the side, and he'd come to help us. Apparently the fishermen, knowing that there was a ranger station up the way, had gone up and alerted them, and then they came to find us.
The most remarkable thing in my mind about this is how Brian Hartnell fought to stay awake and fought to keep his consciousness and fought to get help for Cecilia more than himself. That must have been, that was a heck of an ordeal crawling up to that road. And I just admire the guy.
Deputy Land and myself arrived at just about the same time. It took us a half hour from Napa and or St. Helena to arrive at the location. And we later found out, of course, that the whole crime at least a half hour before we were notified. So we feel that a good hour has gone by. The road that we traveled over to get to this location is a very mountainous, curving, two-lane road with a lot of blind curves. And so driving in an emergency, it was very difficult to get there any faster than we did. It took me 30 minutes from the intersection of Vichy and Monticello Road in Napa. And I figure with the timing that we have discovered that the Zodiac came down the road and passed me at some point going into the city of Napa to make his boastful phone call.
At that time, I was a police officer assigned to the patrol division. What we did, because we were a small department, when the dispatcher, we had a one-person dispatch, when they went on their lunch break, the rookie cop got to go in and fill in as the relief dispatcher. On this particular night, that's what happened. I was out on patrol, went in to relieve the dispatcher for her lunch break, and it was during the time period that I was filling in for her that the call came into the police department. Our switchboard was the old cord type that you plug in when a call comes in. The phone rang, and I recall saying, Officer Slate, Napa Police Department. There was a male voice on the other end of the phone, and he said, I want to report a murder. No, a double murder. They're 2 miles north of park headquarters, and they were in a white Volkswagen Carmen Ghia. My first thought was the ranger that had found these young people had stopped someone and said, I can't get out on my radio, would you get to a phone and call and let someone know that what's going on? So my impulse was to find out where he was so we could get someone to him to talk to. I asked, where are you now? At that point, he said very calmly, I'm the one that did it.
He had a very a precise cadence to his voice. Not an accent, but slow and measured. All I want's your money. Had a real distinctive tone about it, which I told the police then that if I ever heard it again, I would be able to recognize it. I haven't heard it again, but it's had a very unique sound.
And all of a sudden, I heard a clatter. Didn't exactly understand what it was, and what he had done apparently is just dropped the phone from his hand and let it dangle. We learned later that it was a phone booth. As I sat there with the open phone, I could hear voices in the background and the traffic. So at that point, I called the sheriff's office on another line, kept the one line open, told the sheriff's office what had happened, called the operator, asked if we could trace where this phone call had come from.
I believe it was about 8:30 in the evening when I was at the Queen of the Valley Hospital, or maybe right after I'd left there, that the police department had called the sheriff's office and said that they'd received a phone call from an unknown individual.
The sheriff's office had broadcast, I possibly had broadcast, I'm not absolutely positive, that this person had left the phone off the hook. As it turned out, one of the local reporters for the newspaper had heard this broadcast on his scanner, and so he started driving around the city of Napa to see if he could find a phone, and he was the one that actually saw the phone. He then was yelling, "Can you hear me? Can you hear me?" And I could hear the voice, and that's how we located the phone. The operator had not gotten back to us with the location of that phone at that time.
Of course, I immediately called for an ID man to go to the phone booth and preserve whatever evidence was possible. And he spent quite a few hours there and recovered literally dozens and dozens of fingerprints that have not been identified to this day. Some of them were so fresh that he had to artificially dry them so that he could lift the print because it was too moist.
When we arrived at the scene, Cecilia Shepard was in a fetal position on the ground at the base of an oak tree. She was laying on a blanket and had been wrapped in a blanket. I immediately went to her to see if I could administer first aid or do something to help her. She was crying, and she told me she was so cold that she was having a hard time talking. So I asked Ranger White to please go to the patrol car, get my uniform jacket and bring it down, which he did. And while we were putting the jacket onto her, I could see multiple areas on her clothing, front and back, where she had been stabbed. The blood was showing through the clothing. She said, "Brian and I, we're here on the blanket. We're down by the water, and we're just enjoying the afternoon. We're having a nice time talking." And I saw this guy. He was coming down the hillside, and he seemed to stop and watch us. He's looking at us. And I said, "Well, what distance? How far away was he?" And she pointed to an area, and I said, "That's about, looks like 200 to 300 yards away." She said, "That's where I first saw him." And then as we continued enjoying the afternoon and watching the water and reading, I would glance and I noticed he'd get closer, and he was closer, and then pretty soon he was within 75 to 100 feet away. And I told Brian, I said, "That guy has come down here." And then she looked again, and she said he was gone. And I said, "Well, where did he go?" She said he stepped behind a tree. And the tree was 50 to 75 feet away. And when he stepped out, he was pulling a hood over his head. And I said, "A hood?" She said, "Yes." And that was the first that we had known that we had something more than the usual crime that had been committed.
One thing that's baffling is if you're going to kill somebody, you normally don't wear a mask because you got it in your own mind you're going to kill them, so why do you have to hide your identity? So that's always been a puzzling matter in this case. Why did the Zodiac go through such a effort to make this mask to horrify people if he knew he was going to kill them?
And I asked her if she saw him clearly before he put the hood on, and she said, "Yes, I did." And I said, "Well, what did he look like?" And she said, "Well, he had," I said, "What color was his hair?" She said, "Well, it was brown." And "What race was he?" "He was white." And I said, "Well, how about his eyes? Could you see the color of his eyes?" And she said, "No, he had dark glasses on underneath the hood." But she said his hair hung down across his forehead and was showing through the eye holes. I said, "Well, how tall?" "Let me stand where he was when he came up to you and look at me. I'm 5'10". Tell me how he matches my height," because she was laying on the ground. She said, "Well, he's just a little bit taller than you, probably an inch or two taller than you." I said, "Okay. How much did he weigh?" She said he was overweight. He was bulky looking. His clothing was all dark pants, dark shirt, dark jacket, and the jacket was bulky. And I said, "Well, I'm 170. Look at me and judge by my weight and see what you can tell." She said, "Well, he'd have to be at least 20 or 30 pounds heavier." The information that I'm relaying to you now is information that I got directly from Cecilia Shepard. It is accurate for what she told me because I kept notes, and I immediately did a report the following morning so that nothing would be lost. And if things have changed in the course of the investigation, I can't comment on it because I can only report what she told me, and that is what I've just relayed.
Why doesn't anybody know that she saw his face? Why is that unknown?
I didn't report it.
Why didn't you report it?
You know, at the time, I didn't think it was important.
It wasn't until Monday around noon, I believe, that I was notified that Cecilia Shepard had died of her wounds. And then, of course, it was no longer a felonious assault. It became a homicide.
This whole thing took place in about a 20-minute time period. From the time I arrived until the ambulance arrived, it's about 20 minutes. And this is the time that I get all this information.
So your assignment was to go to the hospital?
Go to the hospital and try to get statements from the victims. I talked to the doctor, and he told me there's no way that I could talk to the female victim, Cecilia Shepard.
They brought the two victims in on gurneys and tried to interview them to get some idea of what had taken place, but the girl was already in a coma. We were unable to talk to Cecilia Shepard, the female victim. But Brian Hartnell was in quite a bit of agony, and he was answering questions in short bursts, so to speak. And then the doctor finally said, we have to take him into emergency, so you'll have to conclude this interview. We went up there that night to process the crime scene. It was about midnight when we got up there. We had several deputies on the scene. I interviewed the officers that was there. One was a park ranger by the name of Dennis Land, and the other one was a park ranger by the name of William White, Bill White, sergeant. And at that time, Bill White turned over to me some of the articles that were found at the crime scene. Didn't really make me too happy at the time because I couldn't actually go to the crime scene because someone, thinking they were doing the good thing and the right thing by protecting it, actually bundled up the blanket and the clothing and stuff that was there, and took it into his custody at Berryessa Lake Park headquarters. He thought at the time he was doing a very good thing, but at the same time it took us away from the opportunity to actually view the crime scene. So put it in a few simple words, there wasn't really a crime scene to view.
After the ambulance took the victims to the hospital in Napa, and while waiting for detectives from the Sheriff's Department to arrive, Deputy Land talked to the witnesses that were there and obtained statements from them. I began a search for evidence and discovered a footprint that led from Berryessa Knoxville Road to the victims and back again, which was totally separate from the shoes that they were wearing.
Later on, we were able to determine that it was a military-type shoe, and as a matter of fact, we were able to come up with an identical shoe, an identical footprint in the same size. And it was determined to be what was referred to as a wing walker shoe that was used primarily with the Navy and the Air Force in maintenance due to the static free sole in the shoe, so the maintenance people could walk around the wings of aircraft without creating static electricity. So we thought that was a very crucial piece of evidence.
When I went to the roadway, I saw the white Karmann Ghia, and I saw tracks leading away from it, which we felt may have been tire tracks from the Zodiac's vehicle.
The two front tires were different, which is unusual. Most people buy a set of tires, or at least in pairs, but we had two tires that were distinctively different on the front of this vehicle, which kind of led us to believe it was an older model car by someone that probably couldn't afford to keep up the maintenance on the vehicle.
I looked at the Karmann Ghia, and on the passenger door, the circle with the vertical and horizontal line running through it was displayed on the door, and there were several dates, and then it ended with September 27th, 1969, 6:30 p.m. by knife, which was our crime. And so he had left his calling card, is what he had done. I recognized the symbol on the door as being the same symbol she had described on the hood.
Go ahead, kid. Age before puberty, huh?
First time I've seen it in 38 years.
Critical piece of evidence.
Don't touch.
You know, that's before the days of the what do you call the ones now that we have? You know, I'm talking about the little indelible markers. Sharpie. That's Sharpie. Yeah, that's pre-Sharpie days.
This must be permanent. Is this permanent marker or is it?
It's pretty thin point.
No.
You'll see a little OCD though with the circles being filled in on the time. You know, if you're in a hurry, you wouldn't do that. Like I wouldn't put a dot on July on the J-O. You know, I wouldn't come back. But then to go ahead and take the time to put it on the time is a little...
He was into time. You know, he's continually telling us how far something is, how long it's been. He's very specific.
Except this right here is the only thing that really nails down, you know, with some degree of authenticity, we think, the connection between the pieces.
I agree with you.
Because there's what is there, 30 or so that people think, and you know, there's just no connection. You've basically got these four plus Stein.
That's right.
Then it stopped, which was kind of cool actually. I was no fan of reading the paper for another one.
Yeah, that's one of the questions.